There are 5 functions of slave narratives: to document the conditions of or the truth about slavery, to provide religious inspiration, to assert the narrator's personhood, to challenge stereotypes about blacks, and to encourage the abolition of slavery. Remember that Mary Prince is writing to a particular audience. She's not writing to other slaves because most of them were not taught to read at this time. First, it would have been seen as a waste of time as slaves were used primarily for physical labor. Secondly, it would have been seen as dangerous as slaves often used their ability to read and write to escape out of slavery. They would write themselves a pass, forging their master's signature, and manage to escape to the north or what have you. This is how Frederick Douglass escaped slavery. And third, in many areas, teaching a slave to read and write was against the law. So she's not writing to other slaves. She's writing to white people, primarily white people in England, to try to encourage them to abolish slavery, not just in Great Britain, but throughout all of the British colonies as well. For this reason, she makes it clear to draw a distinction between the two. She talks about the Buckra people. These are white people in the West Indies, and the English people. At one point, she writes, "Oh, the horrors of slavery! How the thought of it pains my heart! But the truth ought to be told of it, and what my eyes have seen I think it is my duty to relate, for few people in England know what slavery is. I have been a slave, I have felt what a slave feels, and I know what a slave knows, and I would have all the good people in England know it too, that they may break our chains and set us free." And more than once she makes it clear that she doesn't hold the British people responsible. We don't know if that's really true or not. She may be bitterly angry. But her goal here is, in part, to get them to abolish slavery. So she has to make her audience think that she's sympathetic with them. So she tells them more than once that she doesn't blame them. She just doesn't think that they know the whole truth. And so she works throughout her narrative to document the truth of slavery. She also provides religious inspiration by telling her own story of Christian conversion, and also by making it clear that people who engage actively in slavery, who own slaves, who drive slaves, become hard-hearted. They turn away from God. In providing religious inspiration and in telling the story of her own escape, in telling the story of her mother and her sisters and her father and her husband, in all of these ways, the narrator asserts her own personhood. Towards the end, when she is brought to England by the Woods, she has the choice at one point to stay or to leave. They open the door and they tell her, if you don't like it, you can go. And she chooses to go. She makes it clear here at the end of the text that if a slave has a choice, they would not choose slavery. This also helps to combat stereotypes about Black people. There are a lot of sort of stories or misrepresentations that Black people don't mind being slaves, that they're happy in bondage. In the last paragraph of the text, Prince writes, "The man that says slaves be quite happy in slavery, that they don't want to be free, that man is either ignorant or a lying person. I never heard a slave say so. I never heard a Buckra man say so until I heard tell of it in England. Such people ought to be ashamed of themselves. They can't do without slaves, they say. What is the reason they can't do without slaves as well as in England? No slaves here, no whips, no stocks, no punishment, except for wicked people. They hire servants in England, and if they don't like them, they send them away. They can't lick them. Let them work them ever so hard in England, they are far better off than slaves. If they get a bad master, they give warning and go hire to another. They have their liberty. That is just what we want." Here, Mary Prince compares the desires of Black people to the desires of white people, and in doing so, she asserts her personhood and also challenges stereotypes. She reminds white people that Black people aren't any different, other than the fact that they are put in bondage. That's it. And by encouraging white people to see Black people as equal, she also encourages the abolition of slavery. She makes it clear that the people of England should fight to give Black people their liberty. She writes at one point, "I tell it to let English people know the truth, and I hope they will never leave off to pray God and call loud to the great King of England till all the poor Blacks be given free and slavery done up forevermore." So Mary Prince fulfills all 5 functions of a slave narrative, and she is clever in her efforts to reach the white audience, in part by drawing a distinction between Buckra, West Indies white people, and Great Britain's white people, in part by showing the similarities between black and white people, and by challenging stereotypes about blacks. She addresses this white audience. She also makes it clear that she doesn't hate white people. More than once, she talks about white people that she cherishes and loves, first and foremost being her first slave mistress. She writes at the beginning of the tale, "I was truly attached to her, and next to my own mother loved her better than any creature in the world. My obedience to her commands was cheerfully given. It sprung solely from the affection I felt for her, and not from fear of the power which the white people's law had given her over me." Again, we can't know for sure if she is being genuine here. She may really have loved her slave mistress as a child, not really understanding the institution of slavery. But remember, she's writing as an adult. And this woman owned her, and she understands the evils of slavery. So it's possible that she's being disingenuous, in part to try to convince the white readers that she's not bitter, that she's not angry, which would be natural. It would be natural for her to be bitter and angry. And yet the readers would be less sympathetic with a bitter and angry individual and might be less likely to encourage the abolition of slavery, which is her chief goal here. Last but not least, I want to talk about how slavery was different for slave women than for slave men. Do not get me wrong here. Slavery was an atrocity, and it was horrible to anybody who had to live under that system. Primarily, even if you had a benevolent master, someone who actually treated their slaves halfway humanely, you still ran the risk of that slave owner dying and ended up being sold. You had no choice whether to stay or whether to go. And the lack of choice, primarily more than anything else, is what makes this institution so horrific. But things were a little different for slave women than for slave men in 2 very distinct ways. The first was sexual abuse. Slave women faced this continuously. In the best of circumstances, slave women did not own their own bodies. So even if they thought they were involved in a consensual relationship, they weren't. They couldn't give consent because they didn't have the right to give consent because they didn't own their own bodies. A good example of this is what happened with our founding father and 3rd president, Thomas Jefferson, and Sally Heming. He gets involved, Thomas Jefferson does, with Sally Heming when she is 15. He takes her to France, where she is actually free. There is no slavery in France. And there he impregnates her. She's only 16 at that point. And she wants to stay in France and raise her child in France. And he convinces her basically to go back with him to America and tells her that if she has any children in the course of their relationship, he will free them when they become 21. And for the most part, he does keep that promise. And some people argue that this was a great romance, this love story between Sally Heming and Thomas Jefferson. And this was not a love story. Sally Heming was a slave. She had no choice. I don't want to go so far as to call Thomas Jefferson a rapist, but he basically engaged in a sexual relationship with a girl. She was not even a woman. She was 15 when he first started having sex with her, who had no choice in the matter. By today's legal definition, that is rape. It was not a consensual relationship. And it's also clear that Mary Prince is the victim of sexual abuse. On page 20, she talks about Captain D's behavior. "He had an ugly fashion of stripping himself quite naked and ordering me to wash him in a tub of water. This was worse to me than all the licks. Sometimes he would call me to wash him, and I would not come. My eyes were so full of shame. He would then come and beat me. One time I had plates and knives in my hand, and I dropped both plates and knives, and some plates were broken. And he struck me so severely for this that at last I defended myself, for I thought it was high time to do so. I then told him that I would not live with him any longer, for he was a very indecent man, very spiteful and too indecent, with no shame for his servants, no shame for his own flesh. So I went away to a neighboring house and sat down and cried till the next morning, when I went home again, not knowing what else to do." So again, she tries to escape, but realizes she has no real recourse, and she goes home. I think it's also important to note her audience. This is a 19th century Victorian audience. Remember what we said about Victorian literature and sort of Victorian prudery of the time period? The way in which, for example, even table legs had to be covered because the legs of the table were too sexually suggestive. Mary Prince can't really come out and say that Mr. D used her sexually or raped her. For one, she might be blamed for that. Remember that there's a stereotype about Black women at the time period, and really that stereotype follows Black women today. That Black women are sexually promiscuous, that slave women can't be trusted around white men. And this stereotype is actually reinforced by white men as an excuse for the sexual abuse that they propagate on these women, right? And so she can't tell the full story. It's possible that she did just wash him in the tub. And it's also possible that he assaulted her and that he raped her and that she could not tell the full tale. The other way that women's lives were different than that of slave men was in childbirth and pregnancy. There is no real evidence that slaves were bred, like quote unquote bred, but there is evidence that slaves were encouraged to pair up and to have children. Slave women were often rewarded for getting pregnant. They might get time off or money, or they might get other kinds of household goods. Despite this, many slave women often still had to do hard labor while pregnant. For example, think of the story of Hetty in the tale. And many women had to watch as their children were sold away. Think about what Mary Prince's mother had to witness. So in this way, the lives of slave women were different than slave men. They had to endure sexual assault and rape, often from their masters or the slave master's son. We never know, for example, who the father of Hetty's baby is. There's no adult male slave that Prince introduces in this tale living at the home of Captain D. So it's very likely that Captain D is in fact the father of Hetty's baby. We do know that Captain D has a son. So it's possible that Captain D's son is the father of Hetty's baby. And this may in fact be why he beats her so severely. He may want her to miscarry. So when you get to your final exam, one of the questions is, how were the lives of slave women different than the lives of slave men? And the answer to that is sexual assault and childbirth and having children, right? So these women were the victims of sexual assault, often the victims of rape. Even in the best of circumstances, they really couldn't give consent because they were not free. They often had to watch their children, sometimes the children of their slave masters, being sold off at auction, and they could not protect them. This is the end of your Mary Prince lesson.